Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is Christian Insua. Today, I plan on discussing my knowledge over the climate crises, and more specifically, giving my insight on climate and racial justice, as well as explaining how these concepts go hand in hand. So, when I first heard of the climate crises, I found myself wondering, as I'm sure many of you are, what even is the climate crisis? The climate crisis boils down to climate change. Scientists believe we are adding to the natural greenhouse effect, with gases released from industry and agricultural trapping more energy and increasing the temperature. This is known as climate change or global warming. The magnitude of climate change beyond the next few decades depends primarily on the amount of heat trapping gases emitted globally and how sensitive the Earth's climate is to those emissions. So, what comes with global warming? Well, it's going to continue to get hotter as temperatures keep getting higher. We can expect a change in rain patterns as well as a frequent heat waves and droughts, specifically in the southwest. The intensification of natural disasters is inevitable, and the sea levels will continue to rise. These are just a few of the main disturbances we can expect from the climate crises. California, my home, lies within this southwest region. According to NASA's Global Climate Change webpage, all of us living in the Western region are to experience increased heat, drought, and insect outbreaks, all linked to climate change. This would result in an increase of wildfires, declining water supplies, reduced agricultural yields, health impact in the cities due to heat, and flooding and erosion in coastal areas are an additional concern. Scary, right? I know all of this can be a bit startling for all of you hearing this for the first time. It can be a bit difficult to absorb. What you're feeling right now after hearing these things is a form of climate grief. Whoa, climate grief? What's climate grief? Well, climate grief can be defined as a psychological response to loss caused by environmental destruction or climate change. Climate grief comes in many forms. There is the bereavement like grief and trauma when a climate change enhanced natural disaster hits you or your close ones. Then there is a transitional grief, a growing awareness that things are changing, and feelings of grief and sadness because of the many losses involved. Many people use the term climate grief to refer to a wider loss and anxiety related to the overall effects of climate change. The lines between climate change and other major ecological catastrophes can become blurred, which is understandable since climate change has an effect on so many other problems. There are many stages to climate grief. However, most of us are in denial, which is the first stage of climate grief. Even when we are experiencing the catastrophes, fires, record high temps, etc., we are still likely to be in some sort of denial. I can relate to this because even though I have been directly impacted, I still had hope that the crisis was reversible. We'll come back to this, but in order to better understand the significance of one's identity and background, we must first discuss climate justice. What's that? Well, it's a term, and even more so a movement, which acknowledges the climate change can have differing social, economic, and public health impacts on underprivileged communities and populations. Our climate crisis is also a cultural issue. Essentially, until we identify the problems and unjust issues occurring within our society, no progress will be made in regards to our climate. The goal of this movement is to highlight the key issue with our system. Our system is intended to only benefit some of the population and leaves these underprivileged populations behind. Climate justice includes both lessening or controlling the effects of climate change, while also correcting this unfair system we currently operate within. Something that I would like to emphasize is that the concepts of climate and racial justice go hand in hand. We, as a society, cannot obtain climate justice without first targeting the issue of racial injustice. Let's take a look at this term, environmental racism. It can be defined as the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on people of color. I believe this I believe this term best describes when the two come together. Climate and racial injustice combined into one term. I would like to dig deeper and provide some examples of this. But first, I would now like to welcome my guest speaker onto the episode. She's going to give us some of her insight on climate injustice, as well as how racial and climate justice go hand in hand.
Yes, thank you for having me, Christian. My name is Giovanna. And yeah, I think what you were saying about the interconnection between climate justice and racial justice is something that's really stressed. And I think it's really important that when we're talking about climate justice, we really have to center racial justice. So what I wanted to start talking about were the effects of redlining first, because as this was a movement that was working to divest money from communities of color and low income communities. It created a lot of devastating effects that lead to environmental discrimination. For example, a lot of low income communities of color are near, first of all, industrial facilities and also freeways. So this creates a lot of greenhouse gases going towards these communities. And there's actually been research studies that link asthma and other diseases due to this fact. And also, because of this divestment, the problem also becomes that there's less tree cover in low income communities. So where the trees are most needed to produce more oxygen and counteract the effects of the greenhouse gases, there's actually less of them and they're more sparse in communities of color. So what happens is not only is this creating a lot of health problems in these communities, but it's also disconnecting a lot of communities from nature, which is something that's very important to mental health and also physical health. In fact, there have been efforts to create community gardens in South LA and in these neighborhoods, but a lot of these efforts have been ignored, and so it creates this divide where a lot of communities of colors are very much separated from nature. So I think what's really important and what can help us kind of, I guess, put this into perspective and look at how this affects us now, very importantly, is looking at the call to defund the police within the Black Lives Matter movement, because this is also connected to environmental justice. Because as we've seen, there's a lot of divestment from these communities, and more higher investment and higher policing in these communities. It goes hand in hand with criminalization. So think of what could happen if you defund our city budget's investment in policing and put it into creating more tree cover in low-income communities of color, and the impact that could have in creating a positive effect for climate justice. So I think that's where these things go hand in hand, and how we can look at racial justice movements and how they also can create a lot of positive benefits when it comes to environmental justice. So yeah, thank you for having me, Christian.
Awesome, amazing. Thanks for your insight, Giovanna. That was awesome. So, moving on, there's this article that's titled "People of Color Experience Climate Grief More Deeply Than White People." And it states that people in communities of color breathe in more pollution, live in higher temperatures, suffer from more diseases, and are displaced at a much higher rate. This section specifically goes hand in hand with the section of the podcast, The Stages of Black Climate Grief, in which they bring on Jackie Patterson with the NAACP. She speaks on the passing of her father, who died of a lung disease that is linked to smoking. Her father, she claims, never smoked a day in his life. According to Patterson, this is a pattern in her community. Reading and hearing these facts and experiences is hard to sit with. Climate change is not theoretical for the people in these communities. It's a lived and present experience. Unfortunately, as a white passing male, I have been accustomed to placing hope before action. This introduces me to the privileges I was granted growing up, which unfortunately led me to be very ignorant and unaware of the severity of the crisis. So climate grief affects us all uniquely. And as I have pointed out throughout the presentation, one's identity plays a crucial role in how we take in and are affected by the crises in general. Who we are and how and where we grew up, our identities, our backgrounds, all play a crucial role in our climate grief. It plays a role in how we process the crises and in how we decide to make a difference. We all have our own roles and parts to play to combat climate change, and the future can still be bright. We just have to be brave enough to believe it. So thanks again, you guys, for tuning in. That was my first episode of the podcast. Here's a look at a few of the sources I used to gather my information. Yep, thanks.